My nephew called me pretending to be in jail and desperately needing bail money, speaking in a panicked voice about how he'd been arrested and needed me to wire cash immediately before anyone else in the family found out. What he didn't know was that I recognized his voice immediately. I knew he was trying to scam me, and instead of hanging up, I decided to play along while I had the police trace the call and set up a sting operation that would land him in real jail. I'm Harold, I'm 68 years old, and this is the story of how my own flesh and blood tried to steal my retirement savings with a phone scam, but ended up learning the hard way that you should never try to con someone who spent 40 years as a detective. Before we continue, please hit that subscribe button and drop a comment letting us know what part of the world you're listening from today. You know, there's nothing quite like the moment when a family member reveals their true character by trying to steal from you, especially when they're stupid enough to try it on someone who made a career out of catching criminals just like them. This story is about trust, betrayal, and what happens when someone who thinks they're running a clever con game discovers they're actually the one being played. It's about the satisfaction of watching a predator walk straight into a trap of their own making, and about the sweet justice that comes when someone who preys on elderly people finally meets their match. Let me start from the beginning, back when I still thought my nephew Danny was just a troubled kid who'd eventually straighten out his life instead of the career criminal he'd apparently become. I'm a retired police detective who spent 4 decades working fraud cases, including plenty of phone scams targeting elderly victims. I've seen every trick in the book, heard every sob story, and investigated hundreds of cases where seniors were bilked out of their life savings by smooth-talking criminals who preyed on their love for family and their desire to help people in trouble. After 40 years of catching scammers and con artists, I thought I'd seen it all and heard every possible variation of every common scam. What I never expected was to become a target myself, especially not from someone in my own family. Danny is my late brother's son, 32 years old, and he's been a disappointment and a source of family drama for most of his adult life. Danny has a long history of bad decisions, failed jobs, substance abuse problems, and minor run-ins with the law. He's been arrested multiple times for petty theft, drug possession, and writing bad checks, but he's never been convicted of anything serious enough to land him in prison for more than a few months at a time. Danny has always been the kind of person who blames everyone else for his problems, and who's constantly looking for easy money rather than honest work. My brother Mike died in a car accident 8 years ago, and since then I've been the closest thing Danny has to a father figure in his life. Mike had always been too soft on Danny, bailing him out of trouble and giving him money whenever he claimed to be getting his life together. After Mike died, Danny occasionally came to me asking for help with rent money, car repairs, or other supposedly temporary financial problems. I'd helped him a few times over the years, but I'd grown increasingly skeptical of his stories and increasingly reluctant to enable his irresponsible behavior by continuing to give him money every time he claimed to be in crisis. The last time I'd spoken to Danny was about 6 months ago, when he'd called asking for money to help with what he claimed were legal fees for a DUI case. I'd refused to help him that time, telling Danny that he needed to face the consequences of his actions and find a way to solve his problems without constantly asking family members to bail him out. Danny had gotten angry and hung up on me, and I hadn't heard from him since. I assumed he'd found someone else to manipulate, or had finally been forced to deal with his problems on his own. The phone call that started this whole situation came on a Tuesday morning in October while I was having my coffee and reading the newspaper. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, I heard what sounded like Danny's voice speaking in a panicked, distressed tone that immediately got my attention. The voice on the phone said, "Uncle Harold, thank God you answered. I'm in serious trouble and I need your help right away. I've been arrested and I'm calling from jail, and I need you to help me get out before this ruins my life forever." The voice continued explaining that Danny had been arrested the night before on what he claimed were false charges, that he needed bail money immediately, and that he was terrified about what would happen if he had to stay in jail while waiting for his case to go to trial. The caller said he'd been given one phone call and had decided to call me because he knew I would understand his situation and would be able to help him without telling the rest of the family about his arrest. He begged me not to contact his mother or anyone else because he was embarrassed about the situation and wanted to handle it quietly. Now, I want to be clear about something important. I recognized Danny's voice immediately, and I knew within the first few seconds of the call that this was definitely my nephew speaking. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity or someone impersonating Danny using information they'd gathered about our family. This was actually Danny himself, calling me and trying to scam me with a fake story about being in jail. But here's the thing that Danny didn't know about his old Uncle Harold. After 40 years of investigating fraud cases, I can spot a phone scam from a mile away, even when it's being perpetrated by my own family. The story Danny was telling me hit every single red flag and warning sign that I'd learned to recognize during my career as a detective. First, there was the urgency and the pressure to act immediately without taking time to think or verify the story. Danny was insisting that I needed to send money right away, that there wasn't time to ask questions or make other phone calls, and that any delay could result in serious consequences for him. This is classic scammer behavior, designed to prevent the victim from taking time to think clearly or to check whether the story being told is actually true. Legitimate emergencies don't usually require immediate wire transfers of money to strangers, and real legal situations don't typically need to be resolved within the next hour or two. Second, there was the secrecy and the insistence that I not contact anyone else who might be able to verify Danny's story or offer alternative solutions to his supposed problem. Danny was specifically asking me not to call his mother, not to contact other family members, and not to reach out to anyone who might be able to confirm whether he was actually in jail or whether his story was legitimate. This is another classic element of phone scams, because scammers know that most of their stories will fall apart if the victim takes time to check with other people or to verify the facts independently. Third, there was the specific request for money to be sent via wire transfer or other untraceable methods, rather than through normal banking channels or legal procedures that would create a paper trail and provide consumer protections. Danny was asking me to send bail money through Western Union or a similar service, to send it to a specific person at a specific location, and to do it as quickly as possible. Legitimate bail payments are almost never handled this way, and real legal emergencies don't typically require elderly relatives to wire money to strangers in other cities. But the biggest red flag of all was something that Danny couldn't have known about. I have contacts throughout the local law enforcement community, and I could have verified whether he was actually in jail with a single phone call. After 4 decades as a detective, I know people in every police department, sheriff's office, and courthouse in our area. If Danny had really been arrested and booked into jail, I could have confirmed that information in less than 5 minutes by calling the appropriate facility and asking about his status. The fact that Danny was discouraging me from making any verification calls suggested that he knew his story wouldn't hold up to even basic scrutiny. So instead of immediately hanging up on Danny or confronting him about his attempted scam, I decided to do something more interesting. I decided to play along with his story while I figured out exactly what he was trying to do and gathered evidence that could be used to prosecute him for his crimes. I told Danny that I was concerned about his situation and wanted to help him, but that I needed to understand exactly what had happened and what kind of help he needed. I asked questions about his arrest, the charges he was facing, and the legal process he was going through, while mentally noting how his answers compared to what I knew about actual police procedures and jail operations. Danny's story was full of inconsistencies and details that didn't make sense to someone with my background in law enforcement. He claimed to have been arrested for a crime that wouldn't typically result in the type of bail arrangement he was describing. He said he was calling from a jail that I knew didn't allow inmates to make unsupervised phone calls to family members. He described legal procedures that don't exist and mentioned officers and facilities that I knew didn't handle the type of case he was supposedly involved in. Every detail of Danny's story revealed that he had no real knowledge of how the criminal justice system actually works, and that he was making up his entire narrative based on what he'd seen in movies or television shows. While Danny continued telling me his fabricated story about being in jail, I was using my other phone to call contacts in the police department and ask them to help me trace the call and identify Danny's actual location. I explained that I was the target of what appeared to be a phone scam being perpetrated by a family member, and that I wanted to gather evidence that could be used to prosecute the case. My former colleagues were happy to help me set up a sting operation, both because they respected my years of service and because phone scams targeting elderly people were a particular priority for their fraud investigation unit. The police were able to trace Danny's call and determine that he was calling from an apartment complex about 30 miles away from where he claimed to be incarcerated. They also ran a quick check of local jail records and confirmed that Danny had not been arrested or booked into any facility in our area. The call was coming from a cell phone registered to a woman named Crystal Martinez, who apparently shared the apartment with Danny and who had a criminal record that included previous involvement in phone scam operations. This information told me that Danny wasn't working alone, and that his attempted scam was part of a larger operation involving multiple people with experience in defrauding elderly victims. While the police were gathering this information, I continued my conversation with Danny, asking more detailed questions about his supposed legal situation and expressing sympathy for his predicament. I told Danny that I wanted to help him, but needed to understand exactly how much money he needed and how I should send it to him. Danny initially asked for $5,000, claiming that this was the amount required for his bail. When I expressed concern about sending such a large amount of money, Danny quickly revised his story and said that he could probably get out for $3,000, or maybe even $2,000 if that was all I could afford to send. This willingness to negotiate the amount of money he supposedly needed was another clear indication that Danny's story was fabricated, since real bail amounts are set by judges and can't be reduced simply because a defendant's family member can't afford to pay the full amount. Real bail bondsmen also don't typically negotiate their fees based on what customers say they can afford to pay. As our conversation continued, I learned more about Danny's scam operation and the methods he was using to target elderly victims. Danny explained that I would need to send the money to a specific person at a specific Western Union location, and that this person would then use the money to pay his bail and secure his release from jail. The person Danny wanted me to send money to was obviously not a legitimate bail bondsman or legal representative, but rather a confederate who would receive the money and disappear with it once the wire transfer was completed. Danny also gave me specific instructions about what information to include with the wire transfer and what to say if anyone at Western Union asked questions about the purpose of the transaction. Danny had clearly done this before and had developed a systematic approach to scamming elderly relatives who were concerned about family members in legal trouble. After about 20 minutes of conversation, during which I gathered extensive information about Danny's scam operation, while the police traced his location and prepared to arrest him, I decided it was time to spring my trap. I told Danny that I was willing to help him and that I would send the money he needed, but that I wanted to speak with someone in authority at the jail to confirm his story and make sure I was handling the situation properly. Danny immediately became agitated and tried to discourage me from making any additional phone calls, claiming that contacting the jail directly might somehow interfere with his case or make his situation worse. This reaction confirmed what I already knew. Danny was terrified that I might discover his lie by talking to anyone who could provide factual information about his supposed arrest and incarceration. But I pressed the issue, telling Danny that as a former police officer, I knew how these situations worked and that I wouldn't send money without verifying that it was actually needed and that it would be used for legitimate legal purposes. I said that I wanted to speak with his lawyer, his bail bondsman, or someone at the jail who could confirm the details of his case and explain the proper procedure for posting bail. Danny became increasingly desperate in his attempts to prevent me from making verification calls, eventually claiming that the jail phones were monitored and that my attempts to investigate his situation could somehow be used against him in court. The final moment of the sting operation came when I told Danny that I was ready to send him the money, but that I wanted him to stay on the phone with me while I drove to Western Union so that I could ask him any additional questions that might come up during the wire transfer process. Danny agreed to this arrangement, apparently believing that he was about to successfully complete his scam and receive the money he'd been trying to steal from me. What Danny didn't know was that, while he was waiting on the phone for me to supposedly drive to Western Union, police officers were surrounding the apartment complex where he was actually located, preparing to arrest him for attempted fraud and elder abuse. The officers had obtained a warrant based on the evidence we'd gathered during our phone conversation, including recordings of Danny's false statements and attempts to defraud me. They'd also identified his accomplices and were prepared to arrest everyone involved in the scam operation. At exactly the moment when Danny expected me to arrive at Western Union and send him money, police officers knocked on the door of the apartment where he was located. I could hear the commotion through the phone as officers announced themselves and entered the apartment to make their arrests. Danny's reaction when he realized that he'd been caught was a mixture of shock, confusion, and anger that was deeply satisfying to listen to. He apparently couldn't understand how the police had found him or how they'd known about his scam operation, since he thought he'd been careful to cover his tracks and hide his location. The moment when Danny realized that his intended victim had actually been setting him up for arrest was probably the most satisfying experience I'd had since retiring from police work. After Danny and his accomplices were taken into custody, I drove to the police station to provide a formal statement about the attempted scam and to review the evidence that had been gathered during our sting operation. The recording of my phone conversation with Danny provided clear proof of his intent to defraud me, and the trace information showed that he'd been lying about his location and his circumstances. The police had also found evidence in Danny's apartment that connected him to previous phone scam operations targeting other elderly victims, including lists of names and phone numbers and scripts for different types of fraud scenarios. This evidence suggested that Danny's attempt to scam me wasn't an isolated incident or a desperate one-time mistake, but rather part of a systematic pattern of criminal behavior targeting vulnerable seniors. Danny had apparently been making a living by defrauding elderly people, using his knowledge of family relationships and his ability to mimic distressed relatives to steal money from victims who thought they were helping family members in crisis. The investigation that followed Danny's arrest revealed the full scope of his criminal operation and the extent of the damage he'd caused to other victims. Police found evidence that Danny and his accomplices had successfully scammed at least 15 other elderly people over the previous 6 months, stealing amounts ranging from $500 to $10,000 per victim. The total amount stolen was over $60,000, representing the life savings and emergency funds of senior citizens who'd been manipulated into believing they were helping family members or friends in legal trouble. Most of Danny's victims had never reported the crimes to police, either because they were embarrassed about being deceived or because they didn't realize they'd been scammed until it was too late to recover their money. Many elderly fraud victims blame themselves for falling for scams and are reluctant to contact authorities because they're afraid of being judged or because they don't want their families to know that they've been taken advantage of. This reluctance to report phone scams is one of the reasons why criminals like Danny are able to continue operating for extended periods and victimize multiple people before being caught. The evidence gathered from Danny's apartment also revealed sophisticated methods for researching potential victims and gathering personal information that could be used to make scam calls more convincing. Danny and his accomplices had been using social media, public records, and other sources to learn about elderly people's family relationships, financial situations, and personal histories. They developed detailed profiles of potential victims that included information about their children, grandchildren, and other relatives who might supposedly be in legal trouble and need immediate financial assistance. This research allowed them to make their scam calls much more convincing by including specific details about family members and personal circumstances that made their stories seem legitimate and urgent. Danny's operation also included multiple phone numbers and false identities that were used to make their scams more difficult to trace and investigate. They'd been using prepaid cell phones, fake names, and temporary addresses to avoid detection by law enforcement. Danny and his accomplices had also been coaching each other on how to sound convincing during scam calls, practicing different scenarios, and developing emotional manipulation techniques that were specifically designed to target elderly victims' protective instincts and their desire to help family members in crisis. The level of planning and sophistication involved in Danny's scam operation was frankly impressive from a technical standpoint, even though it was morally reprehensible and legally criminal. During the investigation, I learned that Danny had specifically targeted me because he knew about my financial situation and because he thought my background as a police officer would actually make me more likely to want to help a family member who was supposedly in legal trouble. Danny had assumed that my law enforcement experience would make me more sympathetic to someone who claimed to be dealing with the criminal justice system, and that my desire to help family members would overcome any professional skepticism I might have about his story. This calculation was both clever and completely wrong, since my background as a detective actually made me much more likely to recognize phone scam tactics and much more capable of gathering evidence that could be used to prosecute scammers. Danny had picked the worst possible target for his scam operation, choosing someone with exactly the knowledge and connections needed to turn his attempted fraud into a successful sting operation. The irony was that Danny's knowledge of my background should have warned him away from trying to scam me, but his greed and his desperation for easy money had apparently overcome his common sense. He'd convinced himself that he could manipulate me the same way he'd manipulated other elderly victims, not realizing that my professional experience made me immune to his tactics and capable of turning the tables on him. Danny's attempt to scam me was like a pickpocket trying to rob a pickpocket, or a con artist trying to swindle another con artist. It was doomed to fail because he'd chosen someone who understood his methods better than he did. The legal proceedings against Danny and his accomplices moved quickly once the evidence was assembled and the full scope of their criminal operation was understood. Danny was charged with multiple counts of fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy, based both on his attempted scam against me and on the evidence of his previous crimes against other elderly victims. His accomplices were charged with similar crimes, and all of them were held on substantial bail amounts that reflected both the seriousness of their crimes and their history of targeting vulnerable victims. The prosecutor handling the case was particularly interested in pursuing maximum sentences because phone scams against elderly people were considered a priority for their office, and because the evidence against Danny and his accomplices was so comprehensive and convincing. Danny initially tried to claim that his call to me had been a misunderstanding and that he hadn't really been trying to scam me, but this defense was completely undermined by the recorded evidence of our conversation and by the additional evidence found in his apartment. The recordings clearly showed Danny making false statements about being in jail, asking for money to be sent via wire transfer, and discouraging me from making verification calls that would have exposed his lies. The evidence also showed that Danny's call to me was part of a systematic pattern of similar calls to other elderly victims, making it impossible for him to claim that his actions had been an isolated mistake or misunderstanding. Faced with overwhelming evidence of his guilt and the prospect of a lengthy prison sentence if he went to trial, Danny eventually accepted a plea agreement that required him to serve 4 years in state prison and pay restitution to all of his victims. His accomplices received similar sentences, and all of them were banned from using telephones or internet services for fraudulent purposes as a condition of their eventual parole. The court also ordered Danny to participate in programs designed to address the substance abuse and mental health issues that had contributed to his criminal behavior, though I was skeptical about his willingness to take advantage of such assistance or his ability to change his fundamental character. The restitution order required Danny to repay the money he'd stolen from other victims, but since he'd already spent most of his ill-gotten gains and had no legitimate assets or income, the practical value of this requirement was limited. Most of the elderly people Danny had scammed would never recover the money they'd lost, which is unfortunately typical in phone fraud cases where criminals quickly spend or hide their stolen funds. The real value of Danny's prosecution was in preventing him from continuing to victimize other elderly people, and in sending a message to other potential scammers that these crimes would be investigated aggressively and prosecuted to the full extent of the law. The case also provided valuable intelligence about phone scam operations that helped law enforcement agencies develop better strategies for preventing and investigating similar crimes. After Danny's sentencing, I received calls from several of his other victims who wanted to thank me for helping to bring him to justice and for preventing him from continuing to steal from elderly people. These conversations were both heartbreaking and inspiring, as I learned about the impact that Danny's crimes had had on people who trusted him and tried to help someone they thought was a family member in crisis. Many of these victims had been financially devastated by Danny's scams, losing emergency funds that they couldn't afford to replace and that they'd been saving for medical expenses or other critical needs. But they were also grateful that Danny had been caught and punished, and that other potential victims would be protected from his criminal schemes. One of the most moving conversations I had was with an 80-year-old woman named Margaret who'd lost $3,000 to Danny's fake grandson-in-jail scam. Margaret had believed that her grandson had been arrested for drunk driving and needed immediate bail money, and she'd emptied her savings account to help him without calling anyone else to verify the story. When Margaret later discovered that her real grandson had never been arrested and had no knowledge of the supposed emergency, she realized that she'd been the victim of a cruel and sophisticated fraud. Margaret told me that the financial loss had been devastating, but that the emotional impact of being deceived and manipulated had been even worse. She'd lost confidence in her ability to make good decisions and had become suspicious of phone calls and requests for help that might previously have seemed routine. Margaret said that learning about Danny's arrest and conviction had helped her feel less foolish about falling for his scam, since she now understood that she'd been targeted by experienced criminals who'd made a career out of deceiving elderly people. Margaret's story reminded me of why phone scams against elderly people are particularly heinous crimes that deserve serious punishment and aggressive prosecution. The financial impact of these crimes can be devastating for victims who are living on fixed incomes and who may not have the ability to recover stolen funds through work or other means. But the emotional and psychological impact can be even more damaging, destroying victims' confidence in their own judgment and their trust in other people. Elderly people who have been victimized by phone scams often become isolated and suspicious, afraid to help family members who might legitimately need assistance, and afraid to trust their own instincts about what's real and what's not. These crimes don't just steal money, they steal dignity, confidence, and peace of mind from people who deserve to live their later years without fear of being preyed upon by criminals. My own experience with Danny's attempted scam was different from that of his other victims because I recognized what was happening and was able to turn the situation to my advantage. But I can easily imagine how the call might have affected me if I'd been less suspicious or less knowledgeable about fraud tactics. Even knowing that Danny was trying to scam me, I was struck by how convincing his performance was and how effectively he used emotional manipulation to create a sense of urgency and crisis. Danny's ability to mimic genuine distress and to present himself as a family member in desperate need of help was genuinely impressive from a technical standpoint, even though it was morally reprehensible. If I'd been less experienced with fraud investigations or more emotionally vulnerable, I might have fallen for his scam despite my professional background. The experience also reminded me of how important it is for elderly people to have support systems and verification procedures that can protect them from phone scams and other forms of fraud. One of the most effective protections against scams like Danny's is simply having other people to call and check with when suspicious requests are made. If elderly people have trusted friends or family members they can contact to verify emergency stories, they're much less likely to be successfully victimized by scammers who rely on isolation and time pressure to prevent their targets from thinking clearly or seeking additional information. Another important protection is education about common scam tactics and warning signs that can help elderly people recognize when they're being targeted by criminals. Many phone scam victims fall for these crimes not because they're gullible or incompetent, but because they're simply not familiar with the tactics that criminals use and the warning signs that indicate a fraudulent situation. Educational programs that teach elderly people about common scams and provide them with specific steps to take when they receive suspicious calls can be extremely effective in preventing these crimes and protecting potential victims. 6 months after Danny's conviction, I was contacted by the district attorney's office and asked to participate in an educational program designed to help elderly people recognize and avoid phone scams. The program involved speaking to groups of senior citizens about my experience with Danny's attempted scam and providing practical advice about how to handle suspicious phone calls and requests for money. I was happy to participate in this program because I believed that sharing my story could help protect other elderly people from becoming victims of crimes similar to the ones Danny had committed. During these educational presentations, I would explain how phone scams work, what warning signs to look for, and what steps to take when receiving suspicious calls. I would emphasize the importance of taking time to think clearly when faced with apparent emergencies, of verifying stories by calling other family members or authorities independently, and of never sending money via wire transfer or other untraceable methods unless absolutely certain that the request is legitimate. I would also stress that falling for phone scams doesn't indicate stupidity or incompetence, but rather reflects the sophisticated and manipulative tactics used by experienced criminals who have made careers out of deceiving people. The response to these educational presentations was overwhelmingly positive, with many participants expressing gratitude for practical information that could help them protect themselves and their families from phone scams. Many people in the audiences had received suspicious calls themselves and had wondered whether they were being targeted by scammers, and my presentation helped them understand how to evaluate and respond to such situations. Several people told me that they'd previously received calls similar to the one Danny had made to me, and that they now realized they'd been targeted by criminals even though they hadn't fallen for the scams. These educational programs also provided opportunities for elderly people to share their own experiences with phone scams and other forms of fraud, creating support networks that could help protect community members from future victimization. Hearing other people's stories about suspicious calls and fraudulent schemes helped participants understand that they weren't alone in being targeted by criminals, and that their caution and skepticism about unsolicited requests for money were appropriate and necessary. The programs also connected elderly people with law enforcement resources and victim assistance services that could provide help if they were targeted by scammers or other criminals. One of the most important messages I tried to convey during these presentations was that elderly people shouldn't be embarrassed about receiving phone scam calls or about being unsure whether requests for help are legitimate. Criminals who perpetrate phone scams are skilled professionals who have developed sophisticated techniques for manipulating their targets and creating convincing scenarios that would fool many people regardless of their age or experience. Being targeted by scammers doesn't indicate weakness or vulnerability. It simply reflects the unfortunate reality that there are criminals who prey on elderly people because they believe senior citizens are more likely to have money available and more likely to want to help family members in crisis. I also emphasize that elderly people who receive suspicious calls should feel comfortable contacting law enforcement for assistance, even if they're not certain whether they're being targeted by criminals. Police departments and sheriff's offices are experienced in handling phone scam investigations and can often provide immediate assistance in verifying whether emergency stories are legitimate or fraudulent. Law enforcement agencies would much rather receive calls from elderly people who are being cautious about suspicious requests than have to investigate crimes after victims have already been defrauded and lost their money. The educational programs I participated in were part of a broader effort by law enforcement agencies and community organizations to address the growing problem of phone scams targeting elderly people. These crimes have become increasingly common and sophisticated, as criminals have recognized that senior citizens represent lucrative targets for fraud schemes. The rise of caller ID spoofing technology and the availability of personal information through social media and public records have made it easier for scammers to create convincing scenarios and to target specific individuals with customized fraud attempts. Law enforcement agencies have responded to this trend by developing specialized units that focus on investigating phone scams and other forms of elder abuse, and by creating educational programs designed to help elderly people recognize and avoid these crimes. But the most effective protection against phone scams remains education and awareness, helping elderly people understand how these crimes work and what steps they can take to protect themselves from becoming victims. This is why I continue to participate in educational programs and to share my story about Danny's attempted scam, because I believe that knowledge and preparation are the best defenses against criminals who prey on elderly people. Today, more than a year after Danny's conviction, I'm proud of the role I played in stopping his criminal operation and protecting other elderly people from becoming his victims. The experience reminded me that retirement from law enforcement doesn't mean retirement from the responsibility to serve and protect the community, and that the skills and knowledge I developed during my career as a detective continue to be valuable in fighting crime and helping victims. Danny's attempt to scam me was ultimately a serious mistake that cost him his freedom and ended his career as a phone fraud criminal, but it also provided an opportunity to prevent other elderly people from being victimized and to educate the community about the tactics used by scammers. I'm also gratified by the knowledge that Danny is serving time in prison for his crimes and that he won't be able to target elderly victims while he's incarcerated. The 4-year sentence he received was appropriate given the scope of his criminal operation and the number of people he'd victimized, and I hope that his time in prison will either rehabilitate him or at least prevent him from continuing to commit crimes against vulnerable people. Danny's accomplices are also serving prison sentences, and their criminal operation has been completely dismantled, protecting the community from their fraudulent schemes. The restitution orders against Danny and his accomplices probably won't result in full compensation for their victims, since career criminals rarely have legitimate assets that can be seized to repay their debts. But the criminal convictions provide official recognition that these people were victims of crimes rather than simply bad decision-makers, which can be important for their emotional recovery and for their ability to access victim assistance services. The convictions also create criminal records that will make it more difficult for Danny and his accomplices to commit similar crimes in the future, since their names and fingerprints are now in law enforcement databases, and they'll be subject to enhanced scrutiny if they're suspected of involvement in future fraud schemes. As for my relationship with Danny, it's obviously been permanently destroyed by his attempt to steal from me, and by his years of criminal behavior targeting elderly victims. I feel no family loyalty or affection towards someone who chose to prey on vulnerable seniors as a career, regardless of our blood relationship. Danny's decision to try to scam me wasn't just a betrayal of family trust. It was participation in a type of crime that I spent my career fighting against, and that I consider particularly despicable because of the harm it causes to elderly victims. I have no interest in maintaining any relationship with Danny after his release from prison, and I've made it clear to other family members that I consider him to be a dangerous criminal rather than a relative who deserves support or forgiveness. The experience with Danny also reinforced my belief that family relationships don't create obligations to enable criminal behavior or to ignore the harm that family members cause to other people. Blood relationships are important, but they don't override moral responsibilities or legal obligations to protect innocent people from criminals. Danny chose to become a career criminal who targeted elderly victims, and he deserves to face the consequences of that choice regardless of his relationship to me or to other family members. Supporting or protecting criminals simply because they're related to you makes you complicit in their crimes and contributes to the harm they cause to their victims. If there's one lesson I want people to take from my story, it's that elderly people are not helpless victims who are doomed to be successfully targeted by phone scammers and other criminals. With the right knowledge, preparation, and support systems, senior citizens can protect themselves effectively and can even help law enforcement catch and prosecute criminals who prey on elderly people. My background as a detective certainly gave me advantages in recognizing and responding to Danny's scam attempt. But the basic warning signs and protective strategies I used are available to anyone who takes the time to learn about phone fraud tactics and to prepare for how to respond to suspicious calls. The most important protective factor is simply taking time to think clearly when faced with apparent emergencies and refusing to be pressured into making immediate decisions about sending money or providing personal information. Legitimate emergencies involving family members can almost always be verified through independent phone calls to authorities or other family members, and real legal situations don't typically require elderly relatives to send money via untraceable wire transfers to strangers in other cities. Anyone who tries to prevent you from verifying their story or who pressures you to act immediately without asking questions is probably trying to scam you, regardless of whether they claim to be family members or representatives of legitimate organizations. Another crucial protective factor is having support systems and verification procedures in place before you need them, so that you're prepared to respond appropriately when you receive suspicious calls. This might include having a list of phone numbers for local law enforcement agencies, having contact information for family members who can verify emergency stories, and having clear personal rules about when and how you'll send money to help people who claim to be in crisis. Preparing for these situations in advance makes it much easier to respond appropriately when you're faced with emotional manipulation and time pressure from criminals who are trying to steal from you. I also want to emphasize that elderly people who receive phone scam calls shouldn't be embarrassed or ashamed about being targeted by criminals, and shouldn't hesitate to contact law enforcement for assistance, even if they're not certain whether they're being scammed. Phone fraud is a serious crime that causes real harm to victims and communities, and police departments have resources and expertise that can help protect elderly people from becoming victims. Law enforcement agencies would much rather help elderly people verify suspicious stories than investigate crimes after victims have already lost their money. And most departments have officers who specialize in elder abuse cases and who understand the tactics used by phone scammers. Finally, I want to stress the importance of education and community awareness in protecting elderly people from phone scams and other forms of fraud. These crimes are preventable when potential victims understand how they work and know what steps to take to protect themselves. But they're devastatingly effective when criminals are able to target people who aren't familiar with fraud tactics or who don't have support systems to help them verify suspicious stories. Community organizations, law enforcement agencies, and individual citizens all have roles to play in educating elderly people about phone scams and in creating support networks that can protect senior citizens from becoming victims of these cruel and destructive crimes. My experience with Danny's attempted scam turned out to be an opportunity to help protect other elderly people and to contribute to the fight against phone fraud. Even though it began as a betrayal by someone I'd trusted and tried to help over the years. The satisfaction of seeing Danny and his accomplices prosecuted and imprisoned for their crimes, and the knowledge that my response to his scam helped prevent other elderly people from being victimized, has turned what could have been a purely negative experience into something positive and meaningful. Crime doesn't pay, especially when criminals are stupid enough to target people who know more about their methods than they do. And justice can be both swift and satisfying when criminals walk into traps of their own making. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of justice and karma. Share your thoughts about this uncle's battle against phone scammers in the comments below. And don't forget to check out our next video for another amazing story of criminals getting exactly what they deserve.